Imagine finding a body in the jungle. It's 1950, the Philippines. The man wasn't just killed, he was drained. Every drop of blood, gone. 2 puncture marks on the neck. The locals whispered one word, Aswang, a mythical vampire demon. They fled the area in terror, leaving the land and the strategic advantage wide open. For years, this was just a ghost story, a legend of the jungle. But 30 years later, a man named Edward Lansdale opened a file and admitted the truth. The monster wasn't a demon. It was an American intelligence operation. This is the story of how the CIA faked a vampire attack to win a war. But to understand why they did it, you have to understand the smell of that jungle. It's thick, it's humid, and in 1950 it was terrified. The body found on that trail wasn't a random victim. He was a message. He was left there, pale and bloodless, specifically for his friends to find. And when they did, they didn't call for a medic. They didn't check for bullet wounds or shrapnel. They looked at the neck, they saw the dry, white skin, and their minds went straight back to the stories their grandmothers told them in the dark. They ran. An entire squadron of hardened guerrilla fighters, men who had survived World War II and fought against the Japanese Empire, abandoned a heavily fortified hill without firing a single shot. They were ready to fight soldiers. They were not ready to fight monsters. For decades, military historians looked at the Hukbalahap Rebellion in the Philippines as a footnote. It was just another skirmish against communism in the early days of the Cold War. But in the shadows of the official reports, something else was happening. The United States wasn't just sending guns and money, they were sending advertising executives, they were sending psychologists, they were experimenting with a new kind of weapon. A weapon that didn't break bones but broke reality. This isn't just a story about a fake vampire, it's a blueprint. It is the moment modern warfare changed forever. It was the moment intelligence agencies realized that if you can't kill the enemy on the battlefield, you can haunt them in their sleep. You can weaponize their own culture against them. Tonight, we are peeling back the redacted lines of the Lansdale file. We are going to walk through the planning, the execution, and the terrifying success of one of the strangest psychological operations in history. We are going to meet the man who decided that the best way to save a country was to terrify it. Forget everything you know about conventional warfare. We are going off the map. Welcome to the jungle. Welcome to the psychological war. To understand the vampire, you first have to understand the desperation. The year is 1950. The dust has barely settled from the Second World War. The Philippines is a free nation, independent from American rule, but it is bleeding. The government in Manila is weak. The economy is shattered. And in the dense green mountains of Luzon, a fire is burning. They were called the Huks, the Hukbalahap. During the Japanese occupation of World War II, these men were heroes. They were the resistance. They were peasants, farmers, and laborers who took up arms to defend their homes when no one else could. But when the war ended and the Americans returned, the Huks didn't just go back to the fields. They felt betrayed. They saw a new government that looked a lot like the old colonial masters. So they kept their rifles, they kept their organization, and they turned their sights on Manila. By May 1950, this wasn't just a rebellion, it was a stranglehold. The Huks were masters of the terrain. They knew every cave, every trail, and every village in central Luzon. To the American military advisors watching from the sidelines, fighting the Huks was like fighting the jungle itself. You could send in a battalion of soldiers with tanks and heavy artillery, and the Huks would simply vanish. They would melt into the foliage. They would bury their weapons and pick up farming hoes, smiling at the soldiers as they marched past. Then, the moment the army turned its back, the ambush would strike. This was the classic guerrilla nightmare. Mao Zedong, the Chinese revolutionary, famously said that the gorilla must move amongst the people as a fish swims in the sea. The Huks were the fish, the villagers were the sea, and the Philippine army was trying to drain the ocean with a teaspoon. It was a disaster. The Philippine constabulary, the police force, was corrupt and brutal. They would raid villages looking for rebels, burn down houses and steal chickens. Every time they did that, they created 10 new Huks. The people didn't trust the government. They trusted the rebels who protected them. Washington was watching this with absolute panic. You have to remember the global context here. This is the height of the Red Scare. China had just fallen to communism in 1949. The Korean War was kicking off. The domino theory was the only thing on the president's mind. If the Philippines fell, the logic went, then all of Southeast Asia would follow. The United States was pouring millions of dollars into the Philippines. They sent surplus jeeps, they sent M1 Garands, they sent radios, but none of it was working. You can't shoot an idea, you can't bomb a whisper network. The Huks were winning because they owned the narrative. They controlled the psychology of the people. The military commanders on the ground were frustrated. They were trained for conventional warfare. They knew how to take a hill. They knew how to hold a line, but there were no lines here. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. The reports going back to the Pentagon were grim. They essentially said, "We are losing. The conventional approach is failing. We don't need more guns. We need a miracle." They needed someone who could think differently. Someone who didn't look at the war as a map of territory, but as a map of the human mind. They needed a man who understood that in a war without front lines, the only real battlefield is what people believe.
And that is exactly who the CIA decided to send. Enter Edward Lansdale.
If you saw him walking down a street in Manila in the early 50s, you wouldn't think he was the most dangerous man in the country. You might think he was a tourist, or maybe a high school history teacher. He was often seen wearing casual clothes, slacks and a loose shirt, driving around in a beat-up civilian car. He played the harmonica. He liked to sit in small coffee shops and chat with locals for hours. But make no mistake, Edward Lansdale was a weapon, he just didn't look like one. Before he was an intelligence officer, Lansdale was an advertising executive. He worked in San Francisco and Los Angeles. He spent his days figuring out how to make people buy things they didn't know they needed. He understood the art of persuasion. He knew that to sell a bar of soap, you don't talk about the chemical ingredients. You talk about how it makes the customer feel. You sell the dream. You sell the emotion. When World War II started, he joined the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, and he brought that advertising mindset with him into the military. Most generals looked at war as a physics problem. Mass times velocity. How many bombs do we need to destroy that bridge? Lansdale looked at war as a marketing problem. Why is the enemy fighting? What do they want? And more importantly, what are they afraid of? He believed that you couldn't defeat an insurgency like the Huks with bullets alone. If you kill a rebel, his brother seeks revenge. If you bomb a village, the survivors join the enemy. Lansdale called this the algebra of revolution. And the United States was failing the math. So when he arrived in the Philippines, his mandate was simple but broad: fix it. He didn't start by ordering airstrikes, he started by listening. This is crucial to understanding Lansdale. He was obsessed with culture. He told his team that they had to know the Philippines better than the Filipinos did. He studied their history, he studied their slang, he studied their humor. He realized the Huks were winning because they had a better story. They promised land to the landless. They promised justice. Lansdale knew he had to break that narrative. He had to make the Huks look weak. He had to make them look like the villains in their own story. This was the birth of modern psychological warfare in Asia. It wasn't about tricking the enemy into walking into a minefield. It was about gaslighting them. It was about creating an environment so confusing, so terrifying, that they would lose the will to fight. Lansdale gathered a small, tight-knit team. They weren't just soldiers, they were creative thinkers. They were the madmen of the jungle. They sat around tables late at night, brainstorming ideas that sounded insane to traditional military commanders. They asked questions like, what does a Huk soldier fear more than death?
And that is a very specific question. Death is a soldier's professional hazard. They accept it. But fear? Fear is primal. Fear is irrational.
Lansdale didn't want to fight the Huk soldiers' training. He wanted to fight his upbringing. He wanted to tap into the childhood nightmares that linger in the back of the brain. He knew that if he could find the one thing that made a hardened guerrilla fighter shiver, he could control the battlefield without firing a shot. And in his research, he found it. He found the old stories. He found the Aswang. Most commanders studied topography. They looked for high ground, choke points, and supply routes. Lansdale studied folklore. He didn't want to know where the enemy was hiding. He wanted to know what kept them awake at night. He tasked his team with a very unusual mission. He told them to go into the villages, sit down with the elders, and talk about ghosts. They weren't looking for communist sympathizers. They were compiling an encyclopedia of superstition. They found that in the rural Philippines, the line between the physical world and the spiritual world was very thin. The jungle wasn't just trees and mud. It was alive. It was populated by spirits, demons, and creatures that had existed long before the Spanish arrived, and certainly long before the Americans. And the most feared of them all was the Aswang. Now, if you didn't grow up in the Philippines, the Aswang is hard to classify. It's not exactly a vampire, and it's not exactly a werewolf. It is something much worse. It is a shapeshifter. By day, it could be a beautiful woman or a shy villager. But by night, it transforms. Some legends say it splits at the waist, leaving its lower half behind, while the upper half flies on bat-like wings. Others say it takes the form of a large black bird or a dog. But the method of killing is always the same. The Aswang lands on the roof of a house or drops from a tree. It has a long proboscis-like tongue, a hollow tube that it inserts into the victim. It drains the blood, or sometimes it sucks out the fetus from a pregnant woman. It is a horrifying image, and for the peasant farmers who made up the rank and file of the Hukbalahap Rebellion, this wasn't just a fairy tale, it was a reality. You carried garlic to ward it off. You avoided certain trails during the new moon. Lansdale realized that this belief was a vulnerability, a massive one. The Huks were occupying a strategic hill in Luzon. The Philippine army had tried to take it by force and failed. The Huks were dug in deep, but Lansdale knew that those men in the foxholes were tired. They were hungry, and they were staring out into the pitch-black jungle every night, listening to the wind. He formulated a plan that sounded ridiculous on paper, but was deadly serious in practice. He called it a Psy-war operation. The objective was simple: convince the Huk rebels that the specific hill they were occupying was the hunting ground of an Aswang. They started with the rumor mill. This is what intelligence agencies call planting the seed. Lansdale's agents would infiltrate the nearby villages, the sea that the Huks swam in. They would sit in the markets and whisper. "Did you hear about the body found on the hill?" one would say. "No bullet wounds, just dry skin, like a husk. They say the Aswang is angry. It's moving back into the high ground." They let these rumors drift up the mountain. They knew the villagers would talk to the rebels. They knew the supply runners would carry these stories along with the rice and ammunition. The hill is cursed. Something is up there. Lansdale waited. He let the paranoia simmer. He let the Huks spend a few nights looking over their shoulders, jumping at shadows. He needed them primed. He needed them to be expecting a monster. And once the stage was set, once the audience was terrified and waiting for the horror show to start, Lansdale gave the order to give them exactly what they feared. The night of the operation, the jungle was pitch black.
Lansdale sent in a special unit. These weren't regular infantry, they were a combat Psy-war squad, hand-picked men who understood the mission. They weren't there to take the hill, they were there to stage a play, a very violent, very real play.
They moved in silence. They knew the Huk patrol routes. They knew where the sentries walked. They positioned themselves in the thick undergrowth, waiting for a straggler. They didn't want the whole squad. They just needed one man, one prop for their stage. They waited for hours. You can imagine the tension, the rain dripping off the leaves, the heat, the mosquitoes. And then, finally, they saw him. A lone Huk fighter trailing behind his patrol. Maybe he stopped to tie a boot. Maybe he stopped to relieve himself. It didn't matter. He was the target. The takedown was silent. They couldn't use guns. Gunshots make noise and bullets leave the wrong kind of holes. They grabbed him from the darkness, a hand over the mouth, a struggle in the mud, and then silence. Now, in a normal war, this is where it ends. You kill the enemy, you leave the body, or you bury it. But for Lansdale's men, the work was just beginning. This is the part that turns the stomach. This is the cold, calculated science of the operation. They took the body of the Huk soldier. They didn't treat him with the dignity of a fallen warrior. To them, he was a canvas. They had to transform a gunshot victim or a strangled man into the victim of a supernatural predator. They took a device designed to puncture the skin. They located the carotid artery on the neck. They punched 2 holes, 2 neat, round holes. The spacing was specific. It had to look like the bite of a giant bat. It had to look like the Aswang. But the visual wasn't enough. The legend of the Aswang says it drains the blood. If the Huks found a body that was still warm and full of blood, they would know it was a trick. They would see the bruising. They would figure it out. So the squad hoisted the body up. They tied a rope around the ankles and hung the man upside down from a tree limb. They let gravity do the work. They waited while the blood drained out of the wounds. They waited until the skin turned that sickly, pale white color that only comes from total exsanguination. It took time. It was a gruesome, messy process. Standing in the dark, watching a man be drained dry so you can fake a ghost story. It's a level of psychological commitment that is hard to comprehend. When the body was empty, they took him down. They didn't hide him. They didn't cover him with leaves. They placed him right in the middle of the trail, the main path that the Huk patrol used every single morning. They staged the scene perfectly. No footprints, no shell casings, just a pale, bloodless corpse with 2 holes in his neck, lying in the morning mist. Then the Americans melted back into the jungle and waited. The sun came up. The Huk patrol came back down the trail, looking for their missing comrade. They were probably annoyed, thinking he had deserted or gotten lost. Then they saw him. The reaction was immediate. They didn't secure the perimeter. They didn't look for snipers. They froze. They saw the skin. They saw the neck. And every rumor they had heard in the village for the last 2 weeks suddenly became solid, undeniable fact. The Aswang is here. Panic is contagious. In a military unit, trust is the only thing that keeps you alive. You trust the man next to you to watch your back. But you can't shoot a spirit. You can't ambush a demon that drops from the trees and drinks your blood. The discipline of the unit shattered. The Huks looked at the trees. Every shadow looked like a wing. Every rustle of leaves sounded like the monster preparing to dive. By that afternoon, the hill was empty. The entire Huk squadron packed up and fled. They left their positions. They left the strategic advantage. They moved to a different mountain, miles away, terrified and demoralized. When the Philippine army moved in the next day to secure the hill, they didn't have to fire a shot. They walked right up. Lansdale's report on the incident was dry and professional. He noted the success of the operation. He noted the enemy's retreat. But reading between the lines, the message was clear. The experiment worked. The vampire was real, as long as the enemy believed it was. The vampire operation was a masterpiece, but it was just a single brushstroke. Lansdale was painting a much larger picture of terror. He knew that you can't fake a vampire attack every night. Eventually, the enemy catches on, so he decided to escalate. He decided to take away the one thing a guerrilla fighter relies on more than his rifle, his anonymity. In the jungle, you are safe because you are hidden. You are invisible. Lansdale wanted to strip that away. He wanted the Huks to feel like they were living in a glass house. He launched a campaign he called the Eye of God. The concept was Orwellian, long before most people in the jungle had ever heard of George Orwell. Lansdale's teams identified villages that were sympathetic to the rebels. These were the places where the Huks slept, ate, and hid their weapons. In the dead of night, the Psy war squads would slip into these villages. They carried buckets of paint. They would locate the house of a known rebel suspect, maybe a man who was hoarding rice for the Huks, or a woman acting as a courier. They would paint a massive, staring eye on the wall of the house, facing the street.
Imagine waking up to that. You step out of your door in the morning and there it is. A giant eye looking right at you.
It sent a very clear, very primal message. We know who you are. We know where you live. We are watching you. The psychological impact was devastating. The villagers panicked. They thought there were spies everywhere. They stopped feeding the rebels because they didn't want the eye to appear on their house next. The Huks would come down from the mountains expecting food and shelter, and instead they found closed doors and terrified faces. The ocean was drying up. But Lansdale didn't stop at the ground level. He took the terror to the skies. He requisitioned small, low-flying aircraft, L-5 Sentinels. He rigged them with massive combat loudspeakers and flew them over the Huk strongholds at night.
Now imagine you are a rebel fighter. You are starving. You are tired. You are hiding in a cave on the side of a mountain. It's 3 a.m. Suddenly a voice booms out of the clouds. It's not a machine. It's a human voice speaking your language, Tagalog.
The voice says, "My friends in the Hukbalahap, you are hungry, you are tired. Your leaders are eating well while you rot in the mud. Why do you die for them?" Sometimes the broadcasts were even more personal. Lansdale's intelligence was so good that they knew the names of the specific units hiding in the specific valleys. The voice would say, "Pepe, we know you are down there. We know your leg is infected. We have medicine. Come down. Surrender. We will help you." They called this the voice from the sky. It was haunting. It sounded like God himself was judging them. It played on the paranoia that was already festering because of the vampire attacks. The Huk soldiers started looking at each other with suspicion. How do they know my name? How do they know about Pepe's leg? The answer, they assumed, was betrayal. There must be a spy among us. The Huks started conducting internal purges. They executed their own men thinking they were informants. They fractured from the inside. They spent more time fighting each other than they did fighting the government. Lansdale didn't just haunt the jungle, he poisoned the trust that held the rebellion together. He proved that if you can make the enemy feel watched, if you can make them feel naked, they will destroy themselves. By 1954, the Huk Rebellion was effectively over. The movement that had threatened to topple the Philippine government had been dismantled. Their leaders were dead or had surrendered. The rank and file had gone back to their farms, broken not by artillery, but by exhaustion and paranoia. Ramon Magsaysay, the defense secretary who had worked so closely with Lansdale, was elected president in a landslide. Washington was ecstatic. To them, Edward Lansdale was a magician. He had won a war on the cheap. He proved that you didn't need to deploy 100,000 troops if you had one guy who knew how to hack the culture. He became a legend in the intelligence community. He was the model for the protagonist in the famous novel The Ugly American. He was the quiet American. But success in the intelligence world is a double-edged sword. If you do something well once, they expect you to do it again and again. Lansdale was packed up and shipped to the next hot zone, Vietnam. The CIA wanted him to work his magic against the Viet Cong. They wanted another vampire. They wanted another miracle. Lansdale arrived in Saigon with his team, ready to replicate the Philippines playbook. He launched Operation Wandering Soul. In Vietnamese culture, the belief is that if a person dies violently and isn't buried properly, their soul is doomed to wander the earth forever in pain. It is a deeply held spiritual fear. So Lansdale's engineers created a recording. It was known as Ghost Tape Number 10. It was a terrifying audio mix. It featured the distorted voice of a dead Viet Cong soldier crying out from the afterlife. "My friends, I come back to let you know that I am dead. I am in hell. Don't end up like me. Go home." They played this tape from helicopters at night, blasting it over the jungle canopies of Vietnam. It was the voice from the sky all over again. But this time, the magic didn't work the same way. The Viet Cong were different. They were more organized, more ideologically hardened, and they had seen the tricks before. While some deserted, many just shot at the helicopters. The vampire trick was a one-hit wonder that relied on a specific moment in time and a specific cultural vulnerability. It wasn't a button you could just push whenever you wanted. However, the failure in Vietnam didn't erase the success in the Philippines. The story of the vampire attack became a case study. It was written into the classified training manuals at Langley and Fort Bragg. It taught a generation of intelligence officers a dark lesson. The truth is irrelevant. In war, there is no such thing as objective reality. There is only what the target believes. If you can control the belief, you control the action. The Aswang operation proved that psychological warfare wasn't just a support function. It wasn't just dropping leaflets, it was a primary weapon system. Lansdale retired, but his methods didn't. You can trace a direct line from the fake vampire bites in the jungles of Luzon to the disinformation campaigns of the Cold War, and eventually to the digital psychological operations we see today. He showed the world that the human mind has back doors, it has glitches. And if you are willing to be ruthless enough, if you're willing to drain a man of his blood to fake a monster, you can walk right through those doors and rewrite the script. The Huks thought they were fighting a demon. They were actually fighting a marketing campaign, and that is the most terrifying part of Lansdale's legacy. He turned the battlefield into a theater, and he turned the enemy's own nightmares into the ultimate weapon.
So what is the real horror story here? Is it the Aswang? No, the Aswang never existed. Is it the body drained of blood? That is tragic, yes. But the true horror isn't the violence, it's the manipulation.
The most chilling part of the Lansdale file isn't that the CIA faked a vampire attack, it's that it worked. It worked because the US government realized a fundamental truth about human nature. We are not rational creatures. We are emotional ones. We are storytelling creatures. Lansdale proved that you don't need a better gun. if you can hack the enemy's mind. He proved that reality is fragile. If you can control the information environment, you can make grown men run from shadows. You can make an army defeat itself. The monster in the Philippines wasn't a demon with wings. The monster was the calculated, industrial-scale manipulation of human belief by a modern government. Edward Lansdale didn't just kill a man to scare a village, he killed the idea of objective truth on the battlefield. Part 4. Conclusion. In the end, Edward Lansdale didn't win the war with napalm. He didn't win it with tanks. He won it with a ghost story. He proved that the darkest corner of the human mind is a battlefield waiting to be exploited. The Huks fled from a vampire that didn't exist, unaware that the real predator was the man sitting in a coffee shop in Manila, rewriting their reality one rumor at a time. This operation was declassified years ago, filed away in the dusty archives of the Cold War. But it leaves us with a question that is harder to shake than any ghost. If intelligence agencies were willing and able to manufacture a mythological monster in the 1950s to win a war, what myths are being manufactured today? What Aswangs are we running from right now without ever realizing that the monster is just a shadow on the wall? I'll let you decide what's real. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden history of psychological warfare, make sure to follow the show. And let me know in the comments, what is a modern myth you think might be a psy-op? I'd love to read your theories. Until next time, watch the shadows.